I hope you guys are having a good week. We are wrapping up our C.S. Lewis series, Reflections on C.S. Lewis 60 years later. This November, coming up in November, will be the 60th anniversary of Lewis's passing. And so we just thought it would be kind of a neat opportunity to spend a few weeks looking at the continued impact that Lewis has in our world today. He seems to have been this really humble servant who had a fascinating life and made himself available to the person of Jesus. And I love studying biographies. I don't know if you're that way. I love biographies of many different people, but especially people who have uniquely made themselves available to God and his kingdom, because it provides me something of I want to do something like that. I want to be available like that. How many times do you guys, you walk out of a movie, I remember summer of 1995, I was in college and I went and saw the movie Braveheart. And I walked out and I was like, I want to go kill some Englishmen. And I didn't know Jeff Lucas then, so I couldn't do it. But there's something about watching someone's life, right, that draws you, that like pulls you and says, man, I want to step up. I want to be available. I want to do something like that. And to me, Lewis is a guy like that, who there's something about his humility of spirit and his heart and his devotion. We'll see little bits of that tonight, but also his imagination, his mind, his willingness to say, I want to bring the person of Jesus to people, as Paul would say, in any means possible. Any means possible. And he does it in ways that in that day weren't typically done. And so again, it's one of those ways that we can, how could we bring Jesus to as many ways possible? Maybe in methods that haven't necessarily been done or used. So next week, we're starting a new series. I think this is in your bulletin. We're going to be walking through the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And Pastor John Mell, our Windsor campus pastor, is going to be here next week to kick that series off. And this is a series that he's done for a couple groups out at our Windsor campus before, and it's had a really, really positive response. So we just thought, well, we want to share that here. We want to make that available here. Also in your bulletin, one thing that I mentioned are some suggested readings. One question that I've gotten a lot of is, haven't read a terrible amount of Lewis. Where should I begin? Great question. And so I just put a few ideas down here. There's so many places that I don't know if there's a wrong place, but The Weight of Glory, the first one mentioned there, The Weight of Glory is a very short sermon he gave. It's a very small book, small text. And I don't know if there's a better sermon I've ever heard that has underscored to me the importance of, the eternal importance of loving my neighbor well. And he does a beautiful job of underscoring and helping you to see that in a reality that every single thing, every single interaction you have with your neighbor, your coworker, whatever, you're pushing them in one of two directions, Lewis says. And he just does it in a way that grabs you. They go, oh my goodness, I need to be more serious about the people that God has placed in my life. The Great Divorce was another example. What I like about The Great Divorce, it's a fiction. It's sort of an imaginative fiction. But here's the thesis that Lewis has that he's trying to prove out, so to speak, in this fiction. Is Lewis's belief was that hell is a freely chosen destination. And as he puts it, it's locked from the inside. And at first thought, you go, that seems absurd. Agreed. I totally agree. Lewis says, yeah, I kind of agree too, but I'm going to set out to psychologically give you cases to prove it. Situation where you go, I could see how someone would prove that. Or kind of put positively, one way that he framed it is that everyone will be in heaven who could possibly stand it. Yeah. And he demonstrates that in this text. Or put negatively, no one will end up in hell who wants God. Not their definition of God. God. And I think he demonstrates that quite convincingly. You walk away from the book and it's sobering, because you think, I could see myself doing that very thing in my head and justifying wanting something more than God. at the end of the day. So I think it's a really interesting book for that. Surprised by Joy, that's his conversion story. I think Dr. Jerry Root talked about this. Did you guys like Jerry Root? Yes. Isn't he the coolest? He's just the coolest guy. It was so much fun having him. Mere Christianity. If you pick up Mere Christianity, let me put it this way. If you're like wondering, I'm not sure about Christianity altogether, start from page 1. If you're just thinking like, I want to explore different topics, these were all standalone messages given on the BBC during World War II, each chapter. So they kind of stand alone. You could jump from one chapter to another. I know some of you have like ADD. You're like, I can't start at the beginning and go through. Okay, pick a part that sounds interesting and just start reading on it. I know for me, he has one chapter called The Great Sin, and it's on pride. I remember my mother telling me, maybe because my mother knew me well, Brent, read that chapter every year. She really did. She said, it's the most convicting thing I read every year. Read this chapter on pride once a year. And I try to do that. And then he has other books, and the next two are kind of ones like that they're not ones that he necessarily put together. They're usually a compilation of either quotes of his or letters. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the number of letters, just handwritten personal letters that Lewis wrote. One of those that I picked up not too long ago, which I think is quite good, it's called Yours, Jack. That's how he usually signed most of his letters, because, of course, if you remember, he didn't go by Clive Staples Lewis. He went by Jack, a name he gave himself when he was about 3 years old, and it stuck. And this book, Yours, Jack, it's a compilation of pastoral spiritual guidance letters in sequence from like 1920 to 1950 something. And you see kind of both the development of his thought, but also his care. They're like these really pastoral, spiritually directive letters to different people on a number of different topics. So he's got a number of books like that. And then the last one on those kind of first bullet point books is one by our own Jerry Root, who a number of years ago, he and one other editor put together a compilation, sort of an encyclopedic, if you like books of quotes, that's a great book. It's a nice, big, thick one. It's just interesting books of quotes that are categorized and cataloged very well, interestingly. And then there's some books about Lewis, not directly from him. One that I just love, I think it's fascinating. It's called The Question of God. C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud debate God, love, sex, and the meaning of life. Dr. Armand Nicolai was a psychiatrist at Harvard University. And the class that he taught that was like maxed out all the time, it filled up every single semester, was this class that he taught. And years later, he put the content of those lectures into a book. And here's what he wanted to do was he said, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm teaching classes on Freud all the time. And I thought, I want to give a contrast. Freud holds to this materialistic, atheistic worldview. And he said, I want to contrast it. So you have sort of both sides. And he said, who could I use? And what he realized is Lewis had imbibed all of Freud's ideas. He bought it all. But then after becoming a Christian, he said, I don't buy all of it anymore. More than that, Freud and Lewis have bizarrely, eerily similar stories. Both of them grew up in religious homes with a distant father and a mother who died early on. Both of them soon after that rejected their faith and became atheists. Both Freud and Lewis were by nature Eeyores. They were kind of negative people just by temperament. So they're both going the exact same direction in life and all these sorts of things. Lewis becomes a follower of Jesus. And his temperament changes, and his life changes. And what's so interesting is Nicolai, he doesn't just write about it like his thoughts. He goes and gets personal letters written from Freud and personal letters written from Lewis. And that's what he uses. Not what did they teach publicly. What did they say privately to friends? And Armand Nicolai thinks that that's going to be more revealing. It's not a public persona that you're getting. It's the true person and what they really thought as they wrote. Friends of theirs, as they wrote family members. What did they really think about God, love, sex, meaning, all these different things? And Armand Nicolai doesn't, at the end of the book, say, this guy won, this guy lost. He just lets you decide. He goes, which life is more compelling to you? And I think it's a fascinating, fascinating book. So, and then I mentioned a book a few weeks ago, Between Heaven and Hell. It's a fictional dialogue, these three guys meeting after death and what their conversations might be. And it's a great introduction because it's very short. Okay, so week one talked a little bit about Lewis, his story, his life, influences on him, how he became the person he was. Week two, Dr. Jerry Root talked about what were Lewis's three core ideas that kind of undergird all of his writings, three big ideas that he had. The third session, Jerry talked about what were the intellectual barriers or obstacles to Lewis coming to faith, and how did he process through those. And tonight what I want to do in wrapping up is look at Narnia and what's been called smuggled theology. Smuggling theology through story. And how did Lewis do that? What's the power of it? What's the significance of it? And then look at just one or two cases in the Narnian Chronicles that hopefully will whet your appetite for some of those, but also help you see the beauty of his method, of his model in doing that. If you've not read the Chronicles of Narnia, and this does kind of whet your appetite, and you're thinking, oh, I'm gonna jump into them. Read them in the order they were originally published, not the modern order. It messed it up. Okay, so find out the old way. The main thing is the magician's nephew needs to be second to last, not first. Don't read that first; it messes it all up for you. Okay, don't do it. A couple of words. Here's what I want to say, a couple of things about. Number one, I want to talk about his writing by hand. There's kind of some interesting pieces about that. His writing of personal letters, both to adults and to children. And then finally, his writing on Narnia and this sort of smuggled theology, as I was saying a minute ago. The first one, writing by hand. Lewis always wrote, by all of his books, he always wrote with a pen in hand. A number of reasons for that. One thing, and this actually had impact on, if you remember I mentioned earlier that when he was a young boy, when he went to boarding school, he received a lot of abuse and mockery and had an awful time. One of the reasons was he had in his hands a congenital defect from his dad. So his thumbs, if you look down at your thumbs, you've got two knuckles. Lewis only had one on both hands, his thumbs, which is to say the knuckle closest to his nail, it looked like a knuckle was there, it was just bone, it didn't bend. So anything that involved catching, ball, throwing, batting, that sort of thing, he was clumsy, and he just felt useless, he couldn't do it, and so kids made fun of him and mocked him, and so as a result of that, he would oftentimes retreat up into his attic, and he would imagine things. One thing he could do with his hands always was he could hold a pen or a pencil. And so he would write stories. He would draw pictures of this place called Animal Land, where these animals wore clothes, and many of them talked, and they had amazing adventures. And there would be mice in metal that they would come out and fight the cats with, and there were talking rabbits. And his imagination was growing as he was oftentimes alone in those times. But he never learned to use a typewriter. He hated the typewriter. In fact, he kind of refused to use it. One little American girl wrote Lewis one time and asked him, give me some advice about writing. I want to be a writer like you are. What should I do? His response back was this: don't use a typewriter. He said, the noise will destroy your sense of rhythm of a story. Interesting. Which still needs years of training. He says he hated, even he would have his brother Warnie, he also had the exact same thing on his thumbs. So he would type like this, two fingers, peck and hunt. But he couldn't stand Warnie doing it in his room with him because of the sound, the noise. So he said, Warnie, you've got to go upstairs. So he would scribble out his text, and he would hand them to his brother Warren, and then he would go upstairs and type them out bit by bit. On average, this is kind of interesting, Lewis wrote so many letters, tons of personal letters. One thing that's interesting about Lewis is his letters are just about as good as his books. Most people aren't that way, but his letters that's why people have published his letters into books, and they're still in print to this day. Listen to some of these statistics here. This is interesting. His secretary, Walter Hooper, was his name. He just only met him a number of months before he died. He was a student there, and he helped collect a lot of his letters and that sort of thing. Hooper estimates, and Hooper's the guy who put together most of these letters, estimates that Lewis wrote about 50,000 letters in his life to individuals, all by hand. Only a couple were done in hand by his brother or Walter Hooper. That's about 3,800 handwritten pages that Lewis wrote back to people. And this is what's so kind of interesting. Lewis wearied of letter writing. At times he despised it. But anyone here despise like answering emails? I hate answering emails. I get so many emails. And usually it's just ones I have to, I've got to give some, referral, please see this person, whatever. But sometimes I'm like, emails are the bane of my existence at all. Lewis received on average 100 letters a week. On average. Can you imagine having to respond to 100 handwritten letters a week, beginning in the 1940s, and it continued for the rest of his life? In fact, he remarked at times he wished that Christmas would never come because of the increase in letters that he got around Christmas time. But here's what's so cool, I think, is that how seriously he took the responsibility of answering each and every letter that came daily, faithfully. He answered every single letter that was sent to him. And he actually viewed it, he said, at one point he said, I haven't had God say many things to me. He said, I'd never heard God audibly. He said, but I do know God said something. An impression, he would say. He said, but I know that God told me, as an offering unto God, I want you to answer every single letter you get. And he was like, But he viewed it as a spiritual discipline. Isn't that interesting? He viewed writing letters as a spiritual discipline and doing it unto God. I wonder what acts of service in your life, if it's caring for someone, if it's a neighbor, someone with a disability, someone with a need. Those just first thoughts just came. I don't know. I wonder what things weary you. And yet God might say, this is a spiritual discipline for you, and I want you to do it as an act unto me, even if it wearies you. And you might just, it's awful. It won't ever be meaningful. And you don't know. Maybe in the future, it will be something that if you were to look back with that perspective, then you might go, oh, that was meaningful. That was deeply meaningful in your life. And you think about it, of all the accomplishments that Lewis had, I don't know if they're any more noble and inspiring than the letters, because it was discipline. He didn't want to do. He liked writing books sometimes. He didn't always like writing letters. So how he wrote by hand, his personal letters, and then number 3, his writing on Narnia. His writing on Narnia. There seem to be several influences here on why did he do this? What's the Narnia thing? Where did he kind of come up with it? I'll give you at least just a couple. Shortly before Britain declared war on Germany, which was 1939, many children who lived in London, because they knew that there was going to be the Blitzkrieg, there's going to be the bombings by the Germans. English families sent their children out of London. If you've read the book, that's how, of course, the book kind of begins. That's what it starts with, because of the air raids. Well, C.S. Lewis agreed to have a number of those children stay at his home because he lived outside of London. He hosted many of the children from London. And from all the reports, he said he really enjoyed the laughter. He enjoyed kids and staying in his home during World War II. In fact, it seems likely that these children caused Lewis to pen what is probably the very first words about something called Narnia, like a decade before he actually wrote anything. Listen to this. This is on the back of a manuscript. This book is about 4 children whose names are Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter. Only one of those is the same. But it's mostly about Peter, who he was the youngest, he says. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of the air raids, and because father, who was in the army, had gone off to war, and mother was doing some kind of work. They were sent to stay with the relation of mother's, who was a very old professor, who lived by himself in the country. Now, the names of the children are different, and we don't hear anything more about Narnia stories for almost a decade later. But this is one of the works that would later coalesce in his mind, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Secondly, is he said, I just had this image in my mind. It would come to me in dreams. I just had the image of a fawn carrying an umbrella. That's it. He's like, I don't know what that's about. And so, reasons why Narnia stories were smuggled theology. What's going on here? Let's look at the form of them, his purpose in them, what's going on. So it's about the end of the 1940s. Lewis has become very popular. As we said a couple weeks ago, his voice was the most well-known voice on the BBC, second only to Winston Churchill during World War II because of the addresses that he gave over the airwaves in order to give the people of England hope. But he's also very well known because of his academic literary criticism, his theological writings that he has turned those talks into mere Christianity. And people called him a reluctant prophet. A reluctant prophet because he didn't have any desire to do theology. He wasn't a theologian. And he said that again and again, I'm not a theologian. But he said there's such sparse resources around, and the theologians aren't speaking to the average person. So he reluctantly engaged in this world. Christianity Today, back then, its editor was Carl F.H. Henry, famous guy. Carl F.H. Henry, the editor of Christianity Today, wrote Lewis, and he asked him if he would be willing to write more journals, articles, books on doctrine, which is so interesting. You've got theologians writing Lewis, who's not a theologian, saying, would you do doctrine for us? Because he had the ability to take cookies from the top shelf and put them on the bottom shelf. But it wasn't dumbed down. It was accessible. And so he viewed that as his call. Lewis wrote Carl F.H. Henry back, and he said this. This is interesting. So he's written a bunch of texts that are doctrine apologetics, and then he writes this. I think I have done my job in writing as straightforward as possible, like mere Christianity. Now, my job is to write in fantasy and symbol. Why is that? Listen to what he says. So as to catch people unawares. Isn't that interesting? I'm going to write in fantasy. I'm going to write in symbol so as to catch people unawares. See, Lewis is living in the modern era, and the philosophy around that is called modernity. Modernity had said this. The pre-modern world said there's knowledge. It's all one area. You can have knowledge of physical things, and you could have knowledge of ethical things, and you can have knowledge of aesthetic things like beauty. Modernity cut a line between the two and said the only things you can know for sure are things you can empirically assess, weigh, see, test in a lab, so to speak. Those are facts. Anything you can't test, see empirically or that sort of thing, that's just your values, and that's all subjective. Kind of sounds familiar. We're living that world out. But that's what happened in modernity. So things like faith, things like the supernatural, things like miracles, where do those belong? Fact or just subjective value, whatever you think? Yeah, they get put into the subjective value category. He's living there. And so what he realized is, as he's writing, trying to compel people to follow the person of Jesus, they immediately just brush that aside because where does that belong? Not in the fact category. That's meaningful to you? Oh, that's how nice is that? Doesn't work for me. Or something along those lines. He's making truth claims. They're not even hearing that a truth claim is being made. Are you with me? They're hearing it as, I like chocolate, you like pistachio. Opinion, value, not rooted in fact, not rooted in reality, I should say. Okay? So Lewis realizes this, everyone I'm talking to, the minute I talk about these topics, they say those aren't facts or truths to be known. Okay? They're subjective beliefs to be held, you might say. This is why he says, I'm going to write in ways so as to speak to people and communicate to them and catch people unawares. And he uses story because that is a brilliant way to do it. And he realizes that his community has, this is England, has a deep history of church going. There's even the Church of England. There's an official state church. The government is paying for this church to be in power. And so everyone has enough of church and Christianity to be immune to it. You with me by that? Everyone has enough to think, oh, sure, of course. And so Lewis said, how can I get to those people who have an immunization to the things of the faith? How do I shock them? How do I get them to hear it anew and afresh? That's a great question. And I think that's a question for every new generation, right? That's what we have to say. How can we do that in a way to have people hear it anew, people who aren't immune to the gospel's power? And so Lewis asks this, how do I reach these people who have been immunized by Christianity? And he said, I need to get past certain inhibition which paralyzed much of my own religious childhood. He recognized that within himself. I was sort of paralyzed to the claims of Jesus because I had enough to be dangerous, but I didn't really get the reality of what the gospel claim was. Why doesn't a person feel these things? And so one author kind of puts it this way in what Lewis did with the message of Jesus. But suppose casting all these things, that's the rational claims, doctrinal assertions, casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glasses, stripping them of their Sunday school associations, you might say their felt board images. That's how I grew up. One could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past the watchful dragons? Do you know what he means by watchful dragons? If you read the old fairy tales and someone's searching for gold, what's always protecting the gold? Dragons. Dragons always protect the gold, right? Lewis is saying, I'm trying to get to a person's heart. That's the gold. What's the watchful dragon? They've been immunized to it. It's these rational arguments that they have in their head from Hume or whatever, these assumptions, sometimes unquestioned assumptions that they have in their head that filters out these ideas from getting to their heart. And so Lewis says, what if I can steal past those watchful dragons with a story? If I invite them into a story and they go, oh, that's interesting, what's going on? And they actually step into the story and they hear it, and then they begin evaluating those claims, not from outside the story, looking at it like this, but they've stepped into the story. And now they're evaluating like this. Oh, that is compelling. Oh, that is scary. Oh, that is dangerous. Oh, that is beautiful. Where from the outside, they would just reject, nope, don't want to have anything to do with that. That's what Lewis realizes is going on here with story. And so Lewis turns, to a lot of people's surprise, to fairy tale, children's story, science fiction. That day and age, that stuff was not as respectable. I'm not saying it's super respectable, but it has more credence today than it did then. It really didn't then much at all. But he uses all these things because he thinks about his favorite teacher in the world, a guy by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus used story, parable, he used symbol, all these different things to get past the watchful dragons. He gets past preconceived ideas to inflame them, to get to the gold, to get to their hearts. The weight of glory, he writes this, he's saying, I want to spin a tale for you. And he says, do you think that I'm trying to weave a spell? He says, perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And remember, what did he think that modernity had done to the world? Put them in a spell about reality. And you and I have the need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment, he says, of worldliness. He means modernity, which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. And he believed that the power of imagination, evoked through story, could get past those watchful dragons. And so we read, even in the very first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, these 4 children, you've got Peter and Susan and Lucy and Edmund, they stumble into this magic wardrobe up in an attic. And if you read that that's why I said don't read the first one. If you read, I think it's the Magician's Nephew, you actually learn how did that wardrobe get there. It has a really interesting background, which takes him into another world, Narnia, and they meet talking animals, and they meet the White Witch, and they meet Aslan. Aslan is the Persian word for lion. That's where he gets that name from, Aslan. And Aslan, he is the true king of Narnia. He's the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. And what they learn, they don't know where he is yet, but Aslan is on the move. And that's the statement that keeps being made. Aslan is on the move. Now, one thing that's important to understand about these stories is they're not allegories. You know what an allegory is? Allegory is where each character isn't really a character in and of themselves. They don't have a backstory. They're not an actual really meaningful person. They just represent something. You with me on that? Kind of the whole concept of allegory? These are not allegories. People oftentimes assume that these are what Lewis called supposals. Here's what Lewis means. Suppose Jesus incarnated himself into another world that's different than ours. How might that go? What might that be like? Well, let's suppose there are creatures there. They're not humans. They're different. How might he create them? How might he bring them about? What might they do when presented with an option to obey him or to disobey him? What might he do in response to them who rebel? What might he do to gain a following? Are you with me? This is a supposal story. If the God of the universe were to incarnate himself into another world, how do you suppose that might be? So are there parallels and overlap? Oh, yes, because his character is the same. But are there differences? Would the story go differently? In some respects, I suppose it would. But would there be some similarities? Yes, I'm sure there would be, right? Because volitional beings there's probably a lot of overlap regardless of what kind of flesh you have. And this God would be quite similar because his character is the same, okay? These are not allegories. Even though you see, oh, that's kind of like this. Yes, of course it is. So that's what's going on in these stories. Not allegories, but supposals in this case. I do want to look at one overarching, I think, really powerful theme that runs throughout these interlocking stories of the Chronicles that most people don't look at or don't see, but I see it running everywhere. I see it in really a lot of them. And again, hopefully it'll kind of whet your appetite. I'll just give you 2 examples where this question is put. It's not posed overtly. It's sort of, it's there, but once you see it, then you kind of see it everywhere. Here's the theme. The theme is answering a question: which story do I trust? The theme that runs throughout, I think, a lot of these is answering the question, which story do I trust? Because there are questions. What is Narnia? Who owns it? What's it all about? And as soon as the children get there, if you remember, as soon as these 4 children get to this world, they enter Narnia, they're hearing 2 different stories, right? Is it a realm owned by the White Witch that she has the authority to do with all as she chooses and they're pawns? Or is it true that Aslan is the true king and will one day return and indwell it? 2 stories. The second they get there, competing stories. They're trying to figure out which one is correct. And I would suggest that's significant because Lewis is saying that's our exact same thing we have to wrestle with. We're presented with 2 different stories, or maybe more than that. Could be 22, I suppose. I don't know. But we're presented with different stories, not of Narnia, but of this world, of existence. Are we just the random collocation of accidental atoms from a mindless, purposeless, pointless universe? That's a story being told. Could be. Or are we in some way the creation of an all-loving, all-powerful God who actually wants relationship, who wants partnership with us? It's a different story. Which story ought we believe? And here's the power of breathing the air of Narnia. When you go there and you breathe the air of Narnia, it helps us, once we do that, it helps us reflect on our world because I'm viewing it inside a different. Remember, I've been invited to step into a story that has gotten past the watchful dragons. And I'm asking all the same questions that I ask in my world, but my defenses are down. I'm asking them differently. Let me give you a couple examples. The Silver Chair. This is one of the books. How many of you guys have read even one of the Chronicles of Narnia? Like, I'm just wondering how much you've read. Okay. So you, good. I just have no idea how much you might be tracking. One of the books, The Silver Chair, 2 human children, Eustace and Jill, are sent into Narnia. But the minute they get there, they have to go underground into caves, okay? So they're in Narnia, but immediately they're underground in caves and in tunnels. These were built by the Emerald Witch. And they're there for so long, that becomes norm. That becomes normal. That's sort of what is. And they go in there in order to rescue their friends. And when they're about to leave, the witch wants them to stay, but she doesn't do it by force to stay. She attempts to enchant them. She starts playing this music. It's kind of seducing them to believe a couple ideas. One is that there is no Narnia, like up above. Life is just caves. And number 2, there's no Aslan. Well, that seems absurd, but really, as she makes this claim, one of the characters, Rillian, says, well, but I've seen it. I know there's an upper land. I know there's an Narnia. I've seen it. The sky is full of stars and the sun. I saw it rising in the east. And the witch asks, I'm sorry, what do you mean by the sun? And he goes, let's see here. And he's looking around and he sees it like a lamp or a torch. And he goes, oh, it's like that. It's kind of like that, but it's bigger. It's more massive. It gives light to the whole overworld, and it hangs up in the sky. She kind of laughs. Oh, that's cute. Oh, that's really cute that you think that there's a giant one of those up there in the sky. She said, the thing that you call the sun, it's just a dream from staring too much at the lamps, at the real thing. And then you sort of projected that small thing onto the big, and that's how you came up with this idea of the sun. And this lion Aslan, you gotta be kidding. Don't you remember that little cat that you saw walking around? See, you saw the cat in my area, and then you kind of projected that up into the sky, onto this sort of bigger canvas, seeing this giant golden lion. But all of these things, she just dismisses as sort of legends, as childish fantasies. Do you see the point? If you've ever studied Freud or Feuerbach, you're picking up on this concept that God is mere wish fulfillment. is what was said. And so, Freud said things like, okay, all of us have earthly fathers, and we think they hung the moon. But then we get older, and we realize, man, our dads are really flawed. They're really weak. They're not that great. We thought they were like supermen, and they're really messed up. And so we have this deep need for that father figure who's all-powerful, who's signal. And so we kind of project that need. And so there's this big guy in the sky. Oh, that's silly. That's quaint. That's quaint. That's sweet. But it's childish, and it's fantasy. It's projection of this sort of superhuman father figure. And so God is only an illusion, a projection out of a deeply held desire to have this, what we have here now, but in a large form. And Lewis says, it's not that God is somehow a copy of our earthly fathers. He says, that's just inverting it. Instead, it's the other way around. Our fathers are just a poor shadow of the real Father that's out there. This torch, this lamp, is just a small shadow of what the Son really is. Similarly, Freud said the same thing about love. When he talked about love, he said, lust is the higher thing. Physical, debased lust is the real, Freud said. Love is just this sort of copied attempt to sort of project it up above beyond this human debased thing. And once again, Lewis, and you see this conversation in that book that I mentioned with Freud and Lewis, he goes, no. You're the one doing the inverting. Love is the true higher, the good. Lust is the debased, weak, pale, sad copy of what love really is. So that's, I think, one example that you see of this idea that Lewis is saying you have two stories that you can believe. You can believe this about reality or that about reality. Another one, and the second one, the last one, is in the book The Horse and His Boy. The horse and his boy. This is a talking horse. That's why it's the horse and his boy, not the other way around. It's a talking horse. And I'll just Joe Rigney, in his book Live Like a Narnian, kind of summarized this piece. So I'm going to read just a little bit of his summary, where he says this. There's this boy, Shasta, and this boy, Shasta, has had a hard life. He's been taken from his true parents. He's sort of, if there's any archetypal character, it's Shasta in all of Lewis's writings. It's sort of the Luke Skywalker who doesn't have his real parents, and he's living somewhere longing for somewhere else, so to speak. Shasta has a hard life, taken from his true parents, raised in the South by this mean fisherman. He has an erratic temper. He beats him from time to time. So he treats him more like a slave. He's living in the South of this country, has no friends, no companionship, just a lonely life filled with a deep yearning for something more, something over the hill in the North. That's where his true people are from, the North. He was sent down there. He's effectively an orphan. No education, no real love, no adoptive father, no hope of a future. And Shasta finds out that there's a plan to kill the king in the North from the evil people in the South where he's living. So he says, I've got to get this message to the king to save him. So he escapes to the North, and there's all these perils. There's roaring lions who chase him. One of them even wounds a partner of his named Erebus, a young girl. She also has a talking horse. So she's wounded by one of these lions as they're constantly running and fighting. They get separated. He sleeps among the tombs. There are these howling jackals there, and he thinks he's going to be eaten by them, and he's not. And there's one little cat that comes walking up, and he kind of snuggles up with for the night, his only companion. And even when there's a glimmer of hope, it's just destroyed by disappointment. Everything that happens, even when he does the thing that's right, he's just asked to do one more thing. And he goes to the place where he can finally stay and rest. And his companions stay, but he's told, no, run. You have to go. And so he's running. He's hungry. Then he's forced off the road because of the other armies coming. And he can't keep up with the good guys because he doesn't know how to take care of a horse. So he takes another path, and he's all alone. His entire life has been at the mercy of the forces that are beyond his control. And he's tossed about by the events of circumstances. He's cut off from love. He's cut off from affection, security. And as he rides up a mountain pass, this deep, thick fog is oftentimes when you go up high. This deep, thick fog sets in, so much so that he can't even hardly see his hand in front of his face as he's walking. And this is what we think. Shasta says, I do think that I must be the most unfortunate boy that has ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got safe away from Tabernash. I was left behind. Arvis and Bree and Hune are all snug as anything with that old hermit. Of course, I was the one who was sent on. King Loon and his people must have got safely to the castle, shut the gates long before Rabadash arrived, but I get left behind. And the combination of loneliness, exhaustion, hunger finally just overwhelms the boys, and tears just begin to roll down his face as he's riding his horse in this deep, thick fog. And then to top it off, all of a sudden his stomach's growling, he's hungry, tear-filled face, and in the midst of a fog, all of a sudden he just becomes aware, and he doesn't know when it started, but he becomes aware there's this enormous beast next to him. He can't see it. He's in the fog, and he is filled with the most terror he's ever been filled with in his entire life, because he can hear this deep sort of breathing, and he realizes it didn't just start. I think it's been there, but I just became aware of it there. And he rides along with this thing breathing beside him until he finally can't stand it any longer. And in the dark of this fog, he whispers, "Who are you? Who are you?" And the thing responds. It says, "One who has long waited for you to speak." The thing said. Its voice was not loud, but it was very large and deep. "Are you a giant?" Shasta asks. He says, "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I'm not like the creatures you call giants." He says, I can't see you. Staring very hard. And then for an even more terrible idea came into his head, almost with a scream. He says, You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please go away. What harm have I ever done you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the whole world. And then the voice breathes a warm, reassuring breath on the frightened child and says, "Tell me your sorrows." And so Shasta does, from being orphaned and beaten by his adoptive father, fleeing from multiple lions, hiding in the ghoulish tombs, to the heat and the thirst of the desert, the loneliness and hunger of the present moment, for a boy who had never known true affection, for a boy who had bottled up all the pain and loneliness in his heart, the opportunity to unload his cares, to unburden his soul, to be really and truly heard, was a profound relief to him. And then the voice surprises him by saying, "I do not call you unfortunate." And then informs him that in all his journeys, there was only one lion. He says, but he was swift of foot. And then most shockingly of all, the voice says, "I was the lion who forced you to join Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals away while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for that last mile so that you would reach King Loon in time. I was the lion you do not remember who pushed you in a boat in which you lay as just a baby child near death so that it came to a shore where a man, wakeful at night, might receive you." And in this moment, Shasta discovers behind all of the what seemed like negative providence in his life, Aslan has this hiding, smiling face. All that he had called bad luck, misfortune, was really the wise, good plan of the great lion. And as he says to Aravis later, Aslan, quote, "seems to be at the back of all the stories." It kind of reminds me of Joseph in the Old Testament with the brothers who sell him into slavery, and he's in Egypt and he gets raised up, but then something bad happens. And finally he becomes the second highest position in all of Egypt and reconciles with his brothers. And you remember his brothers are worried that he's going to be angry because they've sold him into slavery and they gave him this horrible life for so many years. And he says, "What you intended for evil, God intended, or you might say superintended, for good. That's kind of what this is referring to. And having come face to face with the one who has guided every step, he presses to know more. He says, "Who are you?" And it's great. I love this line. First, in a very deep, low voice, he says, "Myself." And then in a very loud, clear, and happy voice, "Myself." And then in a whispered voice, so softly that you almost couldn't hear it, "Myself." And he said, the sound seemed to come from all around me, like even from the rustling of the leaves. And Aslan's triune identification, it's one of the more explicit Christian statements that Lewis is alluding to here. But when he does, it produces in Shasta a different sort of trembling, mingled with gladness and hope. It's almost that longing thing. It's a good pain. It's a scared but yet joyful experience. And seeing the face of the terrible, beautiful, shining lion, Shasta slips out of his saddle, falls to his feet. And Lewis writes, he couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to say anything. And he knew he needn't say anything. And having met this triune lion face to face, Shasta's life, it's forever changed from there on out. So he's not only come to know the king above all high kings in Narnia, but he soon is reunited with his own father, who is Lune, the king of the people of the north. He's this big, kind-hearted king with a twinkle in his eye and a deep affection for his son that he never knew. And Aslan shows up. And why is this important that Aslan shows up at the end of the story? Because unless you believe God is sovereign, unless you believe God can superintend what either you or others have intended for evil or for brokenness or for a path that's just messed up, unless you believe there's a sovereign God who can superintend even our own mistakes, you will be plagued with anxiety because you're going to try to control everything, fix it, and you know how that goes. Or you're going to be plagued with despair because you just realize I have no control of life and everything is an absolute mess. And it comes back to the question, which story will you believe? Which story is true? This exact same question that presents the four kids when they get there and is presented to them all throughout the story, and every single moment keeps being brought back up and back up and back. Why? Because every single day I have to ask that question. Which story is true? I encounter financial ruin or challenge or difficulty, strain in a relationship, and I am pressed, which story is true? I encounter something that is absolutely devastating to my life, a hurt that I couldn't imagine, something that I always prayed would never quite happen. And I have to ask myself the question, which story is true? You don't answer this once. You answer it again and again and again. And each time, if I answer it the right way, I'm tethering my life to the person of Jesus. I'm attaching myself to him. Which story is true? And oftentimes we say, well, God hasn't shown up for me. Oh, but he has. The cross. The cross is the ultimate way of the King of the Kings showing up for you. There's a great place in the Chronicles of Narnia, and I'll close with this. The four children have come into Narnia. Edmund is the one who goes astray, is rebellious, and he's a betrayer. And there's deep magic in the land, that is to say, laws that can't be broken. And the deep magic says that that a traitor's blood belongs to the witch. And so it's been demonstrated. Edmund is a traitor. His blood belongs to the witch. And so Aslan, who loves Edmund, goes and the kids say, well, why don't you just take him back? And he says, oh, no, this is deep magic. That is to say, this is law, can't be broken. It's set up by the king on the far side of the sea. And he said, but if a willing person gives their life in exchange, then the person who has betrayed can be set free. So he goes to the witch and she takes it. You almost get the impression that she wanted that all the way along. So she releases Edmund and takes Aslan. And it's this horrible, gory thing of him being brought to the place of his death, to this big rock. And he's shaved, his mane is gone and tortured. And then finally, in this demonic kind of setting, killed and die. And the two girls are there, Lucy and Susan, and they're watching, and they're broken, they're crying. And they turn around to leave. They realize that it's over. Aslan's gone. And as they turn to leave, they hear this huge crack. The rock has cracked, and they turn around and look, and Aslan's gone. He's not even anywhere to be found. But this giant rock that he was on top of has cracked. Might remind you of in the temple, what was torn. And they're looking, and they go back, and all of a sudden he appears. And he didn't look like he did before. His mane is back, and he's massive, and he's powerful. And they go, Aslan, and they hug him, and they grab him. And they say, what happened? We don't understand. And he said, the queen knew of deep magic from the great king. But he ends by saying this. Though the witch knew the deep magic, that is the blood of traitors belongs to the witch, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. When a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. I love that. Death itself would start working backwards. It reminds me of some of the Apostle Paul's, if I can put this passage up on the screen here. The Apostle Paul writes this, verse 7, we impart a secret hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. There's a deeper magic still that brought about the redemption of the one who was the traitor. That's the gospel. One thing that Lewis said is someone asked him, well, what if someone doesn't see all of the gospel connections in your story? He goes, that's okay. When they actually hear the gospel, we will have awoken the longing for their true home, longing for the true relationship. And when they hear the real thing, they'll go, that's what I wanted. And they will attach their longing to the person of Jesus. That's the power of story. Isn't that beautiful? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you that you are a God who spares no expense, who all day long is wooing us. And our goal is to wake up to your love and to your wooing and then to remain awake. But God, we so often forget. We get distracted, we get bothered, and we forget about the God of the universe who's breathing his love toward us, calling us. Father, may we not resist that longing that you've placed in our hearts. I think of the words of Ecclesiastes that you have placed eternity in our hearts. And may we not fill that with anything less than you. God, I'm grateful for your servant, Lewis, who humbly helped us see you better. God, may we do that for the next generation, for our community. May we help them see you better. May our imaginations and our minds be expanded. Would you give us ideas, Lord, of ways that we can use art and beauty as sub-creators under you to do things that would point to your Son and our King. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen and amen. You guys, thanks so much for sticking along with this series. I hope it was enjoyable. I hope you go read some Lewis and you have fun and it points you to Jesus better. So, hey, have a great rest of your week. Next week, we'll pick up on the book of Revelation. See you guys.